Welcome to this public lecture hosted by the 21st Century China Center here at UC San Diego School of Global Policy and Strategy. We have at GPS a couple of relevant master's degrees in these topics and international affairs and public policy, and also a special degree on Chinese affairs called the Masters of Chinese Economic and Political Affairs, and CEPA for short. This talk really fits with the sort of mission of the 21st Century China Center, which is to develop better understanding of domestic politics within China, as well as the U.S. China relationship, and to provide context through analysis on economics and international affairs, political science, and others, and engage in more policy dialogues to better understand this very evolving and important relationship, which Scott has spent many years in his career working on. So today's lecture is in the hybrid mode, so we do have some folks coming in on Zoom. For those that are on Zoom, you can feel free to leave some questions using the Q&A box, and we'll get to those during the Q&A session. Just a brief introduction of myself, my name is Michael Davidson. I'm assistant professor here at GPS, as well as joint with the Department of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering, and I focus on energy systems transitions, both from engineering as well as institutional perspectives. I'm also a faculty affiliate here with the 21st Century China Center, where I lead a project on China energy markets under the China Data Lab. But for our talk here, I want to just welcome and introduce briefly Scott Moore. So he's the Director of China Programs and Strategic Initiatives at Penn Global and a practice professor and political scientist at the University of Pennsylvania. So his research and teaching interests are really across a wide spectrum of areas: climate change, emerging technologies, international relations. And before that, he's had a number of very important positions, which I think have contributed to his wide range of interests, but also very unique perspectives that we're going to hear from today. Previously at the World Bank, as well as in the State Department in the Environmental Science, Technology, and Health section, where he worked under the Obama administration and worked on a Paris Agreement for climate change. And then his latest book, I have it here, China's Next Act, is really tour de force on a wide range of really important and emerging issues in China and the U.S. China relationship as well. In terms of his background, I think that, Scott, you have the academic triathlon with a Truman, Fulbright, and Rhodes Scholarship. So congrats on that. So with that, I guess we'll just get into the meat of it. Scott, thanks so much for coming here. And yes, we're looking forward to your talk.
Thanks very much, Michael. Great to be here. And famous last words, but it really is a pleasure. I usually don't need any convincing to come to San Diego, but it's really a pleasure to be here. And thanks to 21cc GPS and especially Michael. So as Michael kindly mentioned, I did write a book that came out a couple of years ago. And my goal in writing that book was to try to wrestle with the question of what it means for China's role in tackling shared global challenges when we have an international environment and context that's fundamentally about competition and rivalry instead of cooperation. The book was meant to be kind of mostly geared towards thinking about potential solutions. What I'd like to kind of share a little bit with you today is some early stage thinking about a kind of spin-off of that's a little bit more theoretically motivated, and also tries to take into account two really significant developments that have happened since I wrote the book, and that I think really highlight this growing intersection of geopolitics on one hand and climate action on the other. The first of those two incidents is the suspension of U.S. China climate talks by Beijing in 2022 in response to then House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, and then the Russian invasion of Ukraine, also in 2022. Which resulted in an acceleration of some of the EU's energy transition goals. So two, I think, kind of cases in which we see that this growing intersection between geopolitics, great power rivalry, and its implications for climate action. Just to kind of motivate this a little bit to start off with, Michael mentioned that I had the chance about a decade ago to spend some time in the State Department as a policy fellow, and that happened to be around the time of the Paris Agreement. This is a photo of that was taken of me during that time, and I was really there simply because there was so much U.S. China engagement going on that they needed a low-level person to literally keep track of it all. And that was my job. That was why I was there. The tall gentleman that you see with his hand kind of awkwardly on my shoulder there is John Kerry. And it's actually kind of a hilarious context to this picture. He rarely came into, this is the delegation room where you sort of hang out in between meetings and various kind of engagements. He rarely came in. For some reason, he decided to come in on this particular day. In my defense, it was pretty early in the morning, but when I happened to be reading the paper that you see kind of there before me, pretty clearly not working. And he came right over to me, put his hand on my shoulder and said something to the effect of, "I thought we all pay you guys to work around here," which accounts for the nervous laughter that you see in the photo here too. Point being, this was a moment in which plenty of people, myself included, really felt that the Paris Agreement demonstrated, and again, it really was driven to a large degree by this U.S.-China diplomatic engagement, that was kind of proof that the United States and China were capable of working together on shared global challenges. And a lot of us even kind of took that one step further to believe that in doing that, in cooperating on shared global challenges like climate, we were kind of helping to lay the foundation for a more constructive bilateral relationship going forward. And it's worth remembering that even at this time, 2015 vintage, U.S.-China relations were pretty rocky outside a sort of certain set of issues, of which climate is the best example. Of course, we all know how that turned out, that belief. In the intervening years, the intervening decade or so, we have seen pretty much the exact opposite trend in U.S.-China relations and really in global order more generally, where we've had the rise or reemergence, depending on your point of view, of this idea of rivalry competition between great powers. And probably nothing symbolizes that more concretely than the 2017 National Security Strategy, again, coming just a couple of years, really less than 2 years after what we thought was this kind of crowning achievement of U.S.-China cooperation in the form of the Paris Agreement, declaring that we were now in a period of great power competition and that China was a pure competitor and adversary of the United States. And so what I think is important to kind of think a little bit more about and try to reconcile is what that means for these shared global challenges that certainly have not gone away, despite this change in kind of policy orientation and the context of global order. Finally, I would just note, by way of kind of motivation for this topic, this intersection of okay, excellent. Is that this kind of idea of an intersection between geopolitics, rivalry, and climate action is also something that that has started to be seen and kind of picked up in the news. So it is something that is being talked about and that is part of discourse. Sorry, bear with me 1 second.
Oh, just click on that anywhere on that.
Okay,
Sorry.
no worries. Okay, there we go. So just to kind of spend a little bit of time thinking about kind of the theoretical scaffolding for this relationship between China, geopolitics, climate change, basic kind of starting point. If we think about most of the academic work and really kind of policy action on what it would mean to solve global climate change, it's essentially solving a giant collective action problem whereby all or at least some critical mass of the 198 state parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change have to agree to adopt some type of agreement or regime that results in reliable reductions in global greenhouse gas emissions. The kind of presumption here is that there is some institutional, or at least the aspiration, is that there's some institutional design problem, or sorry, institutional design solution to this collective action problem. And by the way, what this crazy graphic represents are some of the many groupings of those 198 state parties to the UN FCCC. And if you're wondering why the annual conferences of the parties to the UN FCCC typically don't produce a lot in terms of concrete results. This is why. This is kind of a rough schematic of what the actual negotiating process looks like. It's a pretty thorny challenge, is the point. The kind of logic of geopolitics is different. It sort of presents a different conceptual starting point for thinking about this problem of how you solve or tackle climate change at the global level. And instead of presuming that there is some type of institutional design challenge or solution to this collective action problem or challenge, a geopolitical kind of mindset starts with the idea that there are durably opposite interests of states, particularly nation states in the international system, especially great powers. Now, I hasten to kind of add that the term geopolitics is really, I think, a term of convenience rather than a very specific term. And historically speaking, what geopolitics actually meant as a term is the idea that you have nation-state interests that are reliably guided over time by their geographic position. This particular graphic shows one early influential conception of this called seats of power, put forward by a kind of early 20th century geopolitical thinker named Halford Mackinder. And basically what it kind of talks about is you have these parts of the world where whatever nation state controls these kind of key parts of global territory, that kind of determines their position in global order. That type of theory is incredibly deterministic and I think not very relevant in the 21st century. But what is, I think, worth kind of extracting from this concept or this kind of theoretical starting point is the idea that major powers or particularly influential nation states in the international system have interests that are durably opposed to one another and that might present some pretty fundamental or systematic barriers to overcoming the global collective action challenge or problem involved in solving climate change. One concept, and I'll come back to this in a little bit, that I think may be useful, even if the kind of concept of geopolitics per se is not necessarily, is the concept of geoeconomics. And that's really the idea of kind of geopolitics translated into the economic sphere, which is, I think, really fundamentally what we're seeing in terms of climate policy. Kind of final point on the theoretical aspects of things. Those of you who may have studied or kind of be in the fields of international relations, international security, political science, are probably familiar with the idea of environmental or climate security. And at the risk of some gross generalization, the kind of basic supposition of that literature is that you have environmental changes, whether it be climate change or kind of more prosaic or localized environmental changes that have an effect on phenomena of interest, whether it's the likelihood of conflict, violence, disorder, instability, and you have some intervening variables in the middle. But it's fundamentally an environmental change that's at the left side of that equation. That's the causal kind of factor. The idea of geopolitics of climate change kind of inverts that. And it starts with the idea that there are changes in the international system or in global order that have an implication for the climate and specifically for climate action, particularly by way of an effect either on the speed, cost, diffusion of clean energy, the stuff that's going to actually reduce emissions for us, or on the likelihood of solving that really thorny collective action problem. If you have relations between major powers that are not great, that's probably going to make that collective action problem more difficult. That's the kind of intuition. I'm interested in exploring this through this project, but also a slightly different version of this thinking, which still starts with the idea that it's changes in the international system or global order that are the change that's of interest, the kind of starting point that's of interest, but that actually the result under certain circumstances and in certain cases might be positive rather than negative for climate action. And I think the case for that, as I'll kind of get into, relies on basically inverting that the previous kind of slide where instead of seeing slower, more expensive clean technology, we see increased investment in clean technology that actually makes it cheaper and speeds up deployment around the world, and that you get increased spending not just on reducing emissions, but in helping the world adapt to climate change. So that's kind of what I'm interested in exploring through this project. And that also kind of gets us to the case of China, which is really at the heart, I think, of either the intuitive or the kind of hypothesized case of this relationship between geopolitics and climate action. Just to kind of get everybody on the same page, probably this is generally familiar, but China, world's largest emitter, about 30% of global emissions, has been the world's largest emitter since around 2006. Also, on certain comparative metrics, an unusually kind of large contributor to emissions. One of, I think, the most interesting metrics on this is carbon intensity. So when you look at the amount of GDP or the value that's created per ton of CO2 is the typical measure. And on that measure, China is still one of the kind of biggest emissions powers, so to speak, in the world, along with countries like Poland and South Africa. What do these countries have in common? They have a very high proportion of coal in their energy mix, and I'll come back to that in a second. Having said that about kind of China as sort of a general matter in global emissions, it's also important to note and is very significant in the context of thinking about China's participation in international climate negotiations, that if you break down emissions on a per capita basis, still very low relative to most developed countries, especially the United States. And if you look at total cumulative emissions on a historical basis, so roughly since the Industrial Revolution, China is still pretty far behind the United States, although it's edging up very quickly and is now about 60%, even in sort of historical cumulative totals to the United States. But nonetheless, there is a gap on these kind of more equity adjusted, you might say, measures of contribution to climate change. And those are certainly significant when it comes to thinking about China's participation in international climate talks. I mentioned that China's carbon intensity, high carbon intensity, is principally due to the high proportion of coal in the energy mix. This graph shows that pretty clearly. That's the light blue at the bottom. And the other important thing to note is that basically the top of this graph here is fossil free. The yellow is hydro, which is worth noting because that is the kind of single biggest chunk of the fossil free portion of China's energy mix. But you certainly do see very rapid growth in wind, solar, and although at a lower magnitude, nuclear as well. So basically what you've seen is, as a result of China's investments in diversifying its energy mix over the last 15, 20 years, basically China has kind of been bending the curve of its emissions through increased use of fossil-free and especially renewable energy. But those emissions are still increasing. And again, coal is the single biggest chunk of China's energy mix. So how does all this translate into policy and policy action? You could do worse than to look at an article that Xi Jinping penned in Qiushi, which is the Chinese Communist Party's main kind of ideological journal back in November. And it lays out a really interesting vision of how climate and energy policy fits in a broader strategic context. A couple of bolded, I know this is a lot of kind of dense text, but a couple of bolded items that I would draw your attention here to. First of all, major emphasis on decarbonization, climate energy policy as an economic opportunity. This is something that's going to promote transformation and upgrading of China's economic structure, strengthen China's competitive advantage in certain industries. It's also going to be something that is done out of China's own interests. And by the way, this article refers specifically to China's commitment to reach net zero carbon dioxide emissions by 2060 and to peak its emissions before 2030. Those are sort of China's two really core climate commitments. Also, emphasis on doing all of that while ensuring energy security. That's important. We'll come back to that in a second. And finally, that as part of this or as an extension of it, China will participate actively in global climate talks and negotiation. So that is a kind of core element of this, is at least at some level cooperation. So just ticking through kind of those categories quickly. First of all, what is apparent if you kind of look at the data is that China has been pretty successful at creating fairly significant export industries in clean tech, basically from scratch and in a very short period of time, which is this graph shows the dollar value of Chinese solar exports, for example, starting in 2017. And as you can see, those were very low levels, have increased very rapidly, though with a lot of month-to-month variation, and this is monthly data. One thing I would flag in this, though, and I think it's important for thinking about the geopolitical kind of discussion here, the value, and again, this is monthly data, so the value of these exports is equivalent to about 1% of China's total monthly exports. So while this is really significant growth, and in kind of aggregate terms, we're talking about maybe somewhere around 40 billion a year in value of export industries, this is not that significant in the context of China's overall economy and its exports, which I think is just sort of keep that in mind when we come back to the response in the United States to China's clean tech investments. Other thing worth noting is that China does have some significant dependencies on imported fossil fuels, especially liquid fuels. And that is significant both in the context of the commitment to ensure energy security, but also in comparison to the United States, where prior to around 2012 or so, the United States was the large economy most dependent on imported oil. And you can kind of see from the graph on the right-hand side there, that's kind of flipped essentially. And from a geopolitical perspective, that's really important to keep in mind relative vulnerability to energy imports. Final point to note about that, though, in terms of the kind of Xi Jinping idea of what energy security means, he's talking not just about imports, reliance on imports, but also just grid reliability, internal kind of factors, making sure that the lights come on and that electricity is available at affordable rates. But nonetheless, an important component and driver of China's energy and climate policy. Something that doesn't get, I think, enough attention outside China is the role of climate risk and climate vulnerability. But this is something that you see in a lot of Chinese official communications, including in the international climate negotiations. I kind of put up another texty but hopefully helpful kind of illustration of that. And you can see that this document, which is China's national adaptation strategy that was released in 2022, just ahead of COP27, specifically talks about climate change as a non-traditional security factor that essentially has distinct implications or threatens core state interests and objectives. Not necessarily surprising, but worthy of note. Also to say that there's an important kind of political legitimacy aspect to climate and energy policy in China. There certainly are discourses of significant concern around the effects of climate change and the desirability of China kind of playing a leading role in solving this global problem. As a sort of additional dimension of that, there is considerable propaganda value, if you'd like, for China to be able to say to its people that China is not only willing, but also able to solve a massive global challenge like climate change and to be actively involved. And this is one example of that discourse around political legitimacy. So what does this all add up to? Well, a decade ago, at the time of Paris, it all added up to kind of a golden age of bilateral diplomatic cooperation with the United States, in particular in the form of a 2014 so-called U.S. China joint announcement on climate change, and followed pretty quickly by a U.S. China joint presidential statement on climate change. What's significant about both of these is that it committed the United States and China to working together to power or make possible what eventually became the Paris Agreement. And also, particularly in the 2014 statement, this was really the first time that you had a major developed and developing country jointly commit to taking specific actions to reduce their contribution to climate change. That was very significant because in the international process, the divide between developed and developing countries had always been the primary chasm. And then in August of 2022, Nancy Pelosi visits Taiwan, and China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs releases this, a list of countermeasures that were to be adopted in kind of response to this. As you can see, most of those countermeasures relate to kind of defense or security or law enforcement of some kind. But the last of those was climate. And the significance of this was that it showed that a core kind of presumption or aspiration on both sides to insulate cooperation on climate change from broader geopolitical tensions didn't hold up in all circumstances. This was an incident that showed that to some degree, at least, climate cooperation could not be completely insulated from geopolitical rivalry and tension and competition. Although it does bear mention that this suspension was pretty temporary, lasting a little over a year, and was eventually reversed. But it was, I think, very significant in showing very clearly that in the case of relations and cooperation between the world's two largest emitters, it is not, in fact, always possible to insulate climate cooperation or separate climate cooperation from those broader geopolitical tensions. That brings us to what I think is kind of our current status, both in terms of U.S. China relations, and I think somewhat unfortunately a little bit more broadly as well, where we're not only in kind of a period of interaction between geopolitics and climate, but geoeconomics as well. And there are a few aspects of the kind of China story that I want to briefly touch on in terms of explaining what I mean by that. One is that China, invested a tremendous amount of money in building up its renewables industry, beginning really in the mid 2000s, accelerating sharply after the financial crisis, essentially. But a characteristic of investment during that period was that domestic firms were heavily preferred as opposed to foreign or JV partners. And that would become very important later on in terms of being a motivator for a kind of geoeconomic perspective on China's clean energy sector. Related to this, you kind of started to see a movement around 5 years or so ago to really characterize clean technology as a specific arena of economic competition, and especially between the U.S. and China. In particular, John Kerry penned this piece with Ro Khanna, who's a California member of Congress, some of you may know, making exactly this argument that the United States could not afford to let China become kind of the dominant country in the production of clean technology. It's also true, and thinking back to that kind of increase in export value that I showed earlier, that China's kind of success in this sector has to some degree been at the expense of market share of other countries. And that's significant just to show that this is not exclusively this idea of clean technology, renewables as an arena of economic competition is not just limited to the United States. It's also true of several European countries as well. I'm going to start to move a little bit more quickly, but just to kind of flag another kind of few dimensions of China's investments in clean technology. One result has been essential, almost complete dominance in the supply chain of key clean technologies. Solar is one such. This is a graph of supply chain concentration by country. This is basically China, and essentially what it shows is that China has achieved virtually a monopoly in terms of global manufacturing capacity in a lot of key elements of solar panel production. This is also true of minerals, and that's certainly from a political point of view been a major focus of concern from U.S. policymakers. There's also the issue of potential exposure to forced labor, especially in the mining and production of polysilicon. This is an argument certainly that the United States government has made on a regular basis, and certainly to the extent that that is true, it adds certainly another layer to the idea of clean technology as an arena for geopolitics. Also true that there have been some cases in the clean tech sector in which IP theft has been a problem. This particular quote here is from a case that was brought by the Department of Justice back in 2018 involving theft of proprietary wind turbine technology by a Chinese company. That being said, I think the academic kind of literature on IP theft, particularly in the clean tech sector, is much more mixed in terms of both the prevalence, the extent, the degree of kind of organization in it, which we can talk about. But from a political perspective, this notion of clean tech and renewables as a site or arena of IP theft, certainly very significant. Another issue that we've heard a lot more about just recently, including in Treasury Secretary Yellen's visit to Beijing a few months ago now, is the idea of overcapacity and subsidy of China's renewables sector. And this is thinking back to that kind of market share slide I showed earlier, something that you started to see echoed in Europe as well. I hasten to add that the majority of kind of subsidy in China's clean tech sector has been indirect. It's been in the form of things like feed-in tariffs, various forms of policy support, land, cheap loans, free land given by local governments, not necessarily direct subsidy from the central government, which is what's often alleged, but again, from a kind of politics perspective and how this fits into a geopolitical framing, very significant. So where has this taken us? Well, it's taken us in a very protectionist direction. And I again included kind of the text of a letter that Sherrod Brown and John Ossoff sent to President Biden a couple of weeks ago, calling for increased tariffs on Chinese solar panels. Their wish was fulfilled earlier this week when the president announced just that. But it could get even more pronounced if several pieces of legislation that are currently in process, including one that would institute essentially carbon tariffs on Chinese imported Chinese manufactured goods, were to become law. And while that's all kind of on the legislative side in the U.S., on the kind of executive and governmental side, we certainly see the beginnings of what looks to be a clean tech trade war. With China opening a WTO dispute against alleged U.S. subsidies under the IRA for the electric vehicle industry, and again, Secretary Yellen criticizing China's supposed overproduction of clean energy goods. So what does it all mean for the climate? Well, there may be one good effect insofar as this idea of geopolitical competition increases political support for investments in clean technology development and diffusion. And the best example of that is the Inflation Reduction Act. The quote here is what Joe Biden said about the IRA soon after it was passed by at least one house of Congress at that point. It's going to give us the ability to compete with China for the future. Competition with China was an explicit political motivation for this transformative piece of legislation that, while we'll see if it meets, all aspirations, is certainly the most significant investment that the U.S. has made in clean energy and clean technology. I hasten to add, I think the lesson here is not that competition with China, should be the best reason to invest in clean energy or clean technology, but to say that the IRA example gives us one case in which it may be politically important and useful. On the other hand, what geopolitical competition as a motivator or ingredient in climate policy is sure to do is increase the cost of clean energy technology. And you can see that just by comparing production costs for something like solar panels. And basically, what you can see from this cost breakdown is that it's going to be very difficult for the U.S. Or Europe or most other countries to compete with China on manufacturing costs. I hasten to add that your very own Michael Davidson has been really at the forefront of analyzing this effect in a rigorous way and making the critical argument that this kind of restrictionist approach is going to harm diffusion of clean energy technologies. Here's where the case gets a little bit more mixed of what the effect of an environment or context of geopolitical competition or rivalry might be. Diplomatic cooperation. I mentioned that the suspension of U.S. China climate talks was temporary. That disruption did not prevent the U.S. and China from issuing pretty important and significant joint statements, both in 2021, the so-called Glasgow Declaration that's on the left there, and the arguably even more significant Sunnyland Statement just back in November of this year that you see on the right. Those statements are in many respects as kind of substantive as previous statements. And again, they occurred despite that interruption in 2022 in response to Taiwan. So we maybe see kind of a mixed picture there. I think that's also true if you think about climate finance, the potential implication of geopolitical rivalry for mobilizing resources to help countries or communities adapt to climate change. And there was a really interesting kind of dynamic that took place around COP27 in Egypt back in 2022, where a group of small island developing states, a very influential and important constituency in the climate talks, essentially kind of combined with the EU and the US to assail China for not contributing in any meaningful way to multilateral climate finance, despite being the world's second largest economy. That dynamic proved important in creating what's known as the Loss and Damage Fund, which provides some resources to the countries and communities most heavily impacted by climate change, and is arguably a really significant victory or advance in the climate finance discussion. But it's a little unclear that whether that effect will linger or whether this kind of environment of rivalry or competition could unlock further progress or stymie it. Just want to briefly touch on kind of the world beyond just China. I mentioned that the other, I think, important case in which geopolitics seems to have reoriented the prospects for climate action is Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And what this graph just briefly shows is the share of electricity generation and various fuels for the European Union. And what you can see is that in the aftermath of the immediate aftermath of Russia's invasion, wind and solar, share of wind and solar in electricity generation shoots up. The same is true for certain other renewable fuel types. Same was also true of coal, very briefly, has to be said. But there's some preliminary evidence to suggest that basically what the Ukraine invasion did is create a sharp, acute shock for Europe that prompted an acceleration in its energy transition and the shift to renewables. We'll see if that produces a durable effect on emissions, but again, so far the evidence suggests that that could be true. So a case in which a geopolitical event, tragic though it may be, may have had a positive impact on emissions. I just want to kind of close with a couple of thoughts on sort of future directions or implications. One that I'm interested in and trying to watch pretty closely and think closely about is the China-Russia energy relationship, which is really intensified since the Russian invasion. And you can see from this graph just some trends in terms of China's energy imports from Russia. And I think, again, from a geopolitical perspective, it's sort of interesting to contemplate where you might get kind of political and geopolitical alliances fusing with energy sources and creating potentially more durable opposing blocks of countries. I think that's an interesting and disconcerting prospect. I'm just going to race through these next few slides and really just sort of point to some tentative conclusions from this this project so far. So number one, I think the cases that we have, anecdotal and kind of preliminary though they may be, suggest that geopolitical rivalry may be good for climate purposes when it A, accelerates decarbonization policy uptake at the national or regional levels in the case of the EU, B, leads to increased political support for clean tech research, development, and deployment. That's essentially the IRA case. Or C, leads to increased political support for climate adaptation financing. That's really the COP27 case example. Number two, though, responses or policies adopted in the context of geopolitical competition should be steered towards investment, particularly in basic research and development, rather than protectionism per se. And third, and most definitively, climate is emerging as a new arena for geopolitical competition and to some degree information warfare. And actually on that point, I am going to just flag one more thing that I found really interesting in my preliminary kind of work here, which is that at COP27, so in 2022, there was a fascinating but minor flare-up between Russia and Ukraine, wherein Russia officially criticized Ukraine for including Crimea and the eastern territories occupied by Russia in its national inventory of emissions, saying that they should properly be counted as part of Russia's emissions. Probably the first time that a country has argued its emissions should actually be higher than was previously credited. But certainly an example of where disputes over sovereignty and essentially geopolitical phenomena are spilling into the climate policy arena, and certainly having some distinct implications for climate action. So I'm going to stop there with apologies for having run a little bit long here, but we'll really look forward to the opportunity for some discussion. And thanks for coming. Sure. Oh, should I move? Yeah. Yeah.
Right. See. Look at this. There we go. All right. Great. Well, thank you, Scott. That was really interesting, and I think, of course, the hypothesis that you're putting forward is very relevant since it contrasts with a lot of other people's writings, including myself. I would take it personally. So I mean, I guess I wanted to sort of dig into this, right? I mean, there's essentially two opposing forces, right? Of your climate geopolitics or your climate protectionism kind of argument, right? The first is a sort of the conventional view that this hurts climate progress because it makes things more expensive, et cetera, technology, learning, all of that stuff, right? But then the other argument that it enhances competition. And I mean, what I didn't get is like, okay, well, which side of the ledger are we on? Which of those factors is more important, right? Is it more important to have the sort of political benefits from the competition versus the cost, learning, et cetera, benefits, right? I mean, if we make clean energy dirt cheap, we'll just install it even if we don't have any climate policy, but that may not get us all the way to our climate goals. One way that I've thought about, that I've heard people frame it, is a short run versus long run. And I just wanted to see, like, conceptually, if you have a way of distinguishing between those two and how we might evaluate it and say, maybe do a more rigorous policy evaluation of, okay, is this actually on the left side of the ledger or the right side? And so the short run would be like costs go up, but long run political durability is more important. But I'm curious how you would think about how would we put policies on either side of that ledger?
Yeah, well, and I guess maybe I'd start by saying, like, I certainly wouldn't say that you're wrong. You know, because I don't know. All I really have at this point are kind of anecdotes that suggest kind of empirical questions. How you test those empirical questions, I think, is very much something to think more about. I do think there's something in the short run versus long run distinction. I mean, I think really the case for, you know, kind of geopolitics being potentially beneficial for the climate really does depend quite a lot on unlocking to some extent technological progress or development that would not have happened otherwise. And I think the most obvious pathway for that to happen would be, you would say, through something like the IRA, or conceivably even the CHIPS and Science Act. People usually forget the science, but that's the most important part. You get kind of essentially technological progress that's additive, that's additional, that you might not have gotten otherwise. I think that, and so certainly from a long-term perspective, that's where you would hope to see the value. The other cases, I think, are much more speculative. I mean, I think this argument about climate finance, it's sort of like, well, on the one hand, the only argument I could see politically passing muster for unlocking additional public money for adaptation, especially in third countries, would be some kind of competition for influence argument. And I might add briefly that it has happened at low levels where the U.S. government has repurposed some funds that were originally marked for other purposes, including security assistance, for adaptation, and largely in response to kind of China-driven concerns. But it is very much a question if that effect could be, you could observe it.
Okay, yeah, no, that makes sense. Wanted to see if there's any questions in the audience. And as you're kind of ruminating on those, maybe I will also use this opportunity to just briefly ask. So you mentioned the Sunnyland statement. Is this sort of the new norm of U.S. China relations? And I guess I want to ask the question: is Sunnyland's too narrow for the situation that we're facing? Is the people in the room insufficient to address all of these various challenges and get the policy right, as you did as the recommendations at the end? And I guess what would it take? Is there an appetite in the capitals, Beijing, Washington, but also Brussels, to have a broader set of discussions around how do you get those policies right? Investments, not protectionism, et cetera, et cetera.
Not right now.
Short answer.
Hopefully, yeah, short answer. I mean, hopefully at some point in the future. But sort of there is like a underlying thing here that I've sort of focused on, like the climate manifestation of the trend toward protectionism. But the bigger story is, I think, how quickly and completely politics has really shifted, on trade and investments really around the world. I mean, with the exception of some small, very export-dependent countries like Singapore, there are very few defenders of kind of a liberal trading system. I do think that climate is one of the areas in which it's easiest to point to the negative ramifications of that. Insofar as in my mind, it's unquestionable that it will slow to some extent decarbonization, simply because it inevitably makes clean tech more expensive. But I think in terms of, so I guess just to answer your question, I think having that discussion about climate and clean energy would sort of require tackling the bigger political trend towards being more in favor of protectionism.
Yeah. Okay. Open it up here for questions. Okay, we've got Lay and then far back. Yeah.
Scott, can you give us a bit of a mapping of the domestic interests coalescing around, decarbonization and then both in China and the U.S. How that might affect the interstate rivalry? Because in both countries there are major forces for and against.
That's correct. Yeah.
And how do they play into this geopolitical tension?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think certainly in China, this is sort of like a generalization, but you basically have the energy and kind of environment kind of segment of the bureaucracy that is largely in favor of decarbonization. And I would add to that, though small in number, they're kind of significant. There's a kind of growing slice of China's diplomatic corps that's really kind of like been brought up doing climate issues, and this is pretty new. That's sort of a feature of certainly recent decades, and more particularly the past decade. So there is kind of there are elements in other kind of parts of the bureaucracy too that are in favor of a more ambitious and aggressive climate policy. On the other hand, you certainly have parts of officialdom, primarily those that are responsible for energy security, grid reliability, energy supply, and to some extent, employment, economic growth, kind of more generally, who are generally speaking in favor of slowing or making less ambitious China's decarbonization. And I hasten to add that that's a critically important from a global climate perspective. I mentioned, and as you know, the commitment is to peak emissions before 2030, but the slope of the curve after that makes all the difference in terms of meeting global temperature, kind of control goals. So that matters tremendously. And in general, the kind of slow rollers have generally won the arguments. And if, a lot of that Till showpiece, but also a lot of the public statements that Xi has made since 2020 announced the decarbonization goal have kind of been in the vein of, well, we have to build the new before abolishing the old and ensure energy security. So those are good signs, I think, that the kind of locus is there. I think in terms of how that affects the geopolitics, I think it does place more onus on things like imported energy, trying to reduce reliance on imported energy. I think somewhat perversely, it has tended to enhance the importance of the Paris Agreement in China's climate policy. Doesn't get a lot of attention outside China, but China is always very careful to clarify that the Paris Agreement should be the foundation of international climate action and is an important part of China's own climate policy. And so you've actually, and frankly, in contrast to a lot of other policy areas, you've actually seen more pro-multilaterals in the climate policy arena. Yeah.
See if you can, we have one question in the back. Okay, sure. Yeah, maybe we could do those, both of yours together since we're getting on time.
Sure.
Or see if you could address the Europe-China relationship in the context of climate action and decarbonization. As you know, that this week, the Biden administration announced a 100% tariff on EVs from China. Europe, you've got EVs selling for under 20,000 euros. I think there's pressure in Europe to try to address this issue. On the other hand, China's been doing a lot diplomatically in Europe to try to decouple Europe from the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
How does that play into climate politics and to China's agenda more globally?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm happy to take the second question.
Thank you. So in general, countries don't trade, companies do.
Yeah, fair point.
In China, there's an enormous market for green technologies. Now, I'm curious as to the level of market concentration of companies in China as producers.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think with respect to the EU, I mean, I should clarify, like I'm, not an EU kind of specialist. So this is just sort of a surface reaction. But I think number one, it is surprising and kind of out of character for Europe to have gone down such a protectionist path when it comes to, because, if you think before like 5 minutes ago, the EU's top two priorities were climate change and competition. And so it would seem kind of natural that, the European Commission would be the voice of, kind of avoiding protectionism and climate, but it's been the opposite, as you point out. And essentially the EU approach has been to copy American policy with respect to domestic content provisions, tariffs, things like that, subsidies. I think that is ill-advised. My sense is that just for practical reasons of policy coordination as well as fiscal ones. Europe doesn't really have the capacity to carry out that policy. I think Michael and I were talking about this earlier, and Michael, I think, put it well that, it's kind of essentially creating like a subsidy race, that it's hard to see how the EU could win. That being said, I didn't dwell on it, but the graph I showed of Chinese solar exports, Europe's the most important export market by far, and that remains true. I think that will probably continue to be true for the medium term as Europe continues to have really ambitious climate policies. So it's very much a contradiction for the time being. And we'll see if the EU changes course. I suspect at some point they'll kind of be forced to by reality on the protectionism. So on the market concentration, and I guess there's sort of like globally versus domestically. Generally speaking, the global market concentration is pretty high for most clean technologies of interest. In terms of at the firm level, it's actually like there's actually quite a bit of competition. So, EVs are a good example of that, where it's actually a pretty cutthroat competitive sector within China. And sort of interesting, kind of approach where kind of industrial policy was designed so as to affect some import substitution there and some leapfrogging, but also to encourage a lot of competition within the sector. And I think at least with EVs, that seems to have been pretty effective. Although I think the real test of export competitiveness in EVs is kind of we're seeing that now. The verdict isn't quite in, I think.
Great, we got Barry and then behind you. Yeah.
So a fascinating approach. I really enjoyed it a lot. I'm struck that the balance between the different effects sort of depends on the extent to which the United States and Europe can be considered to be actually committed to green transition. If they actually are committed to green transition, then the fact that it's maybe a little bit more expensive for the first 5 years, but then it's big enough industries that we all get on the cost curves and start to bring unit costs down, it's not going to matter. And the political coalition in favor of it is perhaps stronger because you have more domestic firms producing for it. On the other hand, if our commitment isn't strong, then the fact that we're paying 20–25% more erodes political commitment to it. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about these sort of flip-flop perspectives.
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think there are also, to which I don't know the answer. All I can sort of add as an additional question in that vein, which is, so I had the chance to meet along with some others, Liu Jianmin, China's sort of newish climate envoy, this past weekend. And he made it was sort of passing, but pointed point that that the U.S. decarbonization commitment depends on full implementation of the IRA, which there are significant political and fiscal reasons to question. And I thought that was, kind of a fair point. So again, I don't know the answer to it, but I agree that it's sort of a debatable point whether, to the extent that you're using kind of geopolitics as an argument for climate policy, does that actually kind of promote policy durability in the long term? I guess maybe the only final point I would offer is probably to the question about policy durability probably is going to be affected by variables other than geopolitics. It's probably going to be affected by domestic political institutions, the veto players, those kinds of things, rather than, the kind of initial framing of geopolitics or something else.
Okay. And I'm really sorry, but we have to conclude now. But let's first of all give Scott Round of applause. So, and I'm sure we have a few minutes afterwards for the questions that folks did get to. So just a few final remarks. One is you can continue the climate conversation with another event that's happening just a few buildings over on bipartisan politics of climate change in the U.S. with it's currently I think it's being hosted in the Institute of the Americas at 5 p.m. Folks interested can walk over there. And then for this series, our next public lecture will be on June 7th. We'll have Qin Hui, who's a historian and public intellectual, and is going to be talking about Chinese historical discourses on elections. So that should be interesting. And that's going to be delivered in Chinese with some online English caption. So we hope to see you there on June 7th. And thank you again, Scott, for being with us.